Thank you, Kim. I came down my favorite river today from up around just below Yellowstone. And the great Yellowstone River that the Indians call the Elk River is my favorite river in the world. And you know, when Osborne Russell came through here in the later 1830s, he noted that there were more grizzly bears on the Elk River bottom than any place he'd been. And this is a mountain man that's been all through Yellowstone and everything else. I mean, this was the place. So it wasn't hard to get down here. And of course, the reason that I'm here today is because today is the anniversary of 9/11. You know, and it's the event that launched our modern series of wars, and inevitably that led to a couple more generations of veterans returning home with wounds, some visible and some otherwise. And I'm going to speak a little bit to that tonight and read a few things. It's a lot of territory, and we'll just make the best we can with our time. I think, oh, right, you got a little feedback there. You know, the title we used was The Use of Ceremony and the Importance of Wilderness in Healing the Wounds of War. Actually, I just made that up. I'm not really quite sure what it means, but we'll chip away at it, you know. The traumas of war, we talk so much about them today, it almost seems commonplace. And that, of course, is in contrast with my own experience. When I came back from Vietnam, we didn't have names for those things. You know, for 25 years, I thought maybe I was the only one, but I wasn't. And I had, you know, I came back in in the late spring of 1968 after a couple tours of the Green Beret Medic. We called them tours then instead of deployments, you know, because you basically got shipped over there by yourself and kind of abandoned for a couple of years, and I kind of liked it. It was for a soldier that chafed under authority, you know, was an anarchist dream, because I was on remote A camps and I would go all day long without speaking a word of English, you know, until I got back to the team house and I'd said, "Give me a beer." Also, a week ago, about 8 days ago, we celebrated another anniversary, and that's the 50th birthday of the Wilderness Act, you know, and a day of some ceremony. Ritual observation and celebration of anniversaries is one of the definitions of ceremony. And, you know, the reason I'm here today is, on this day, to talk about the use of ceremony and the practice of the wild. If we were all Navajos and we were warriors that just came back from a war before we'd be unleashed on our communities, we would undergo the warrior's way, you know, a ceremony. Leslie Silko, a Laguna Indian, wrote a book called Ceremony, and it was the same thing. Pueblo Indians are integrated back carefully because warriors weren't necessarily fit to mix with civilized communities again until they'd undergone certain purification ceremonies. Our own culture, our own mainstream culture, doesn't provide us with much ceremony, and sometimes we just have to make up our own. And I've had to do that, create ceremonies in sacred places, and you know, to deal with what I used to call my war sickness, and because I didn't have another word. And you know, I want to share part of that with you today. And one further item that I'm going to talk about is part of this book. You know, the oldest ceremony in the Americas, the oldest ceremony of which we have evidence, was the ritual burial of a Clovis child near Wilso, Montana, up the Shields River, just, you know, a little over 100 miles upstream. And the child was buried with sacred red ochre, and, you know, 110 of the most functional and spectacular Clovis tools ever seen. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is a story I've been working on for 15 years. And, you know, I first went in there with a couple archaeologist friends and got permission to kind of to re-examine the site and reestablish its stratigraphy. We really didn't excavate any new ground. But, you know, my plan then was to repatriate the child. I wrote it up for Outside Magazine, and, you know, it's the last sentence of the book said we should rebury the child. Well, to make a long story short, we finally got it done this June. You know, the child is back, and, you know, they've got all the science they need out of him, and the child is back where he belongs. I'm going to read, you know, I'm going to read, that story in itself explains so much of the origins of the first Americans, the origins of the mammoth hunters, and, you know, indeed, it's all our story. You know, it's the original, not just Montana origin myth, but the origin of all people on this country. Anyway, and if we got some time, we'll, I hope you've got some questions or comments, and we'll do that. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. My own unremarkable story really started when I came back from Vietnam in March of 1968. And, you know, like a lot of other veterans, I was out of sorts, and I didn't know why. One place I've always been comfortable, even before Vietnam, is the woods, the wilderness. My dad was a professional Boy Scout guy. I was raised in the woods. And so you know, I was no good around my family. I couldn't talk to anybody. So I camped out. And, you know, I camped out. I ended up camping out for, you know, a decade and a half. So you know, I started out in the Rocky Mountains when the snows were, you know, still around. I was in Navajo country and moved up as the snows melted into the Wind Rivers. And, you know, on the east side where the weather was terrible, and there weren't any grizzlies in those days. I wasn't looking for grizzlies, and I didn't know much about them. But in the Wind Rivers, I came down with a malaria attack, which was not it might be a big deal, but it was not uncommon. I'd had 2 or 3 of them since coming, and once I got back, I had two or three acute episodes of malaria. I get malaria like some people get colds. You know, I went back to Vietnam in 1911, and there's pictures of me with Andrea and everybody in their shorts, and, you know, and I've got piled jackets on, and I'm shaking like crazy up at Long Bay in Quezon with malaria. So anyway, to get out of the Wind Rivers, I decided I was going to go to Yellowstone Park, which in comparison to the Wind Rivers is flat, and the climate is much more benign than the east side of the winds. You know, the winds have the second biggest glaciers in the lower 48 next to Mount Baker. You know, there's a reason those glaciers are up there. You know, it snowed and rained on me every day until I just got so, you know, sick of golden trout that I had to get out, and the malaria gave me an excuse. So anyway, I came into to Yellowstone, and I knew a little bit about Yellowstone, and I was going to go back to a thermal area and soak in the hot springs because I was just weak as a kitten from the malaria, and, you know, kind of the old spa notion, you know, soak in the hot waters and regain my health and all of that stuff. So one October day, I'm soaking in a little hot creek. It actually starts out boiling hot, ends up tepid. So you go upstream, downstream to get whatever temperature you want. And I was in pretty hot water, you know. And it wasn't a very big creek. It was only, you know, 4 or 5 feet across. And I was sitting in a little bathtub with the hot water pouring over my neck, and the wind was blowing. It was a chill day, but the hot water was taking care of that. And all of a sudden, off to the side, I looked out, and there was a sow grizzly and 2 yearling cubs, just 150 feet away, really. You know, I didn't know much about Grizz at that time. You know, my own education were men's magazines like True and Argosy. You know, they just say, well, you better carry a really big piece, you know. And so I decided I was going to climb a tree when these bears weren't looking at me, you know. And there was a tree right next to me growing out of the bank of this creek. And so the bears, they never, ever paid any attention to me. But, you know, when they were eating some oh, it's like a blue-green grass.